Medieval people slept in cold castles by layering textiles, sharing beds for warmth, and creating small, warm microclimates within larger, colder rooms. And whatever fairy tale image of a castle you have in your head right now, the soaring spires, the cozy torchlight, burn it. It's a lie. A marketing ploy sold to you by Disney and every fantasy novel on your shelf. The reality was a freezing, damp stone coffin. The walls didn't just feel cold, they wept with moisture. The air wasn't filled with romance. It was thick with soot from a fire that choked you more than it warmed you. And the stench, a cocktail of unwashed humanity, rot, and the latrine blowing back in the wind. This wasn't a palace. It was a survival bunker for the 1%. And here's the real question that should keep you up at night. What if their brutal, freezing, communal sleep, huddled together for warmth, sharing beds with servants and dogs, was actually healthier than your climate-controlled, memory foam cocooned, isolated modern sleep? What if their misery holds the key to why you feel so tired all the time? This isn't a history lesson, it's an intervention. Forget the idea of a pristine, grassy castle courtyard seen in films, a place for knights to spar and ladies to stroll. This is a romantic fiction. As the first snows fell and the threat of winter deepened, the castle's outer yard, or bailey, would undergo a radical and foul transformation. It became a crowded, chaotic, and unimaginably stinking animal pen, a fortified barnyard where the line between human and animal existence was almost completely erased. In an age without refrigerated transport or industrial farming, a household's wealth and its very ability to survive the winter were measured hoof and horn. To protect these invaluable assets, the powerful oxen needed for spring plowing, the sheep prized for their wool and meat, and the pigs that could miraculously turn kitchen scraps into life-saving bacon, from the dual threats of freezing weather and opportunistic predators, they were brought within the castle's main defensive walls. The economic imperative for this move cannot be overstated. Outside the walls, hungry wolf packs, emboldened by the scarcity of prey in the snow, posed a constant, terrifying threat. Just as dangerous were human raiders, rival lords or desperate bandits, who knew that livestock left in open fields were an easy prize. To lose an ox was not merely to lose a source of meat, it was to lose the engine of the following year's harvest. It was the difference between a planted field and a fallow one, between sustenance and starvation for the entire community. To lose sheep was to lose the raw material for the next year's clothing. This was not a sentimental act of animal welfare. It was a cold, hard economic calculation where the bailey, a space normally occupied by blacksmiths, fletchers, servants, and soldiers, was sacrificed, transformed into a churned-up quagmire of mud, half-frozen puddles, and a truly staggering amount of manure. The sensory assault on the castle's inhabitants was relentless and unavoidable. The ground itself devolved into a treacherous, sucking bog of earth, spilled feed, animal urine, and dung that would cling to every boot and cloak hem, ensuring the filth was tracked into every part of the castle keep. This slurry would freeze overnight into jagged, ankle-twisting ruts of ice and dung, only to thaw by midday into a foul-smelling swamp. The noise was a constant, maddening cacophony. The deep, mournful lowing of cattle, the incessant, nervous bleating of sheep, the high-pitched, frantic squeals of pigs, and the squawking of chickens, all echoing off the stone walls from dawn until long after dusk. The overwhelming stench was a physical presence that permeated every corner of the castle. Not just manure, but the sour smell of wet wool and fur, the hot breath of beasts in the cold air, and the iron tang of blood from the corner where animals were slaughtered. This proximity created a relentless, back-breaking workload for the castle's lowest-ranking inhabitants, who were tasked with feeding, watering, and attempting to muck out this ever-growing mountain of filth in the freezing cold. Beyond the filth, the threat of disease was ever-present and poorly understood. Zoonotic illnesses like brucellosis, undulant fever, anthrax, or ringworm could jump from beast to man with ease in such close quarters. The very air, thick with animal dander and microscopic particles of dried feces, would have been a potent vector for respiratory ailments. The castle, in its desperate attempt to protect its wealth, had effectively become a fortified petri dish. The line between human and animal world dissolved entirely into a shared, stinking and noisy struggle for survival, where the inescapable perfume of dung and smoke became the defining scent of a medieval winter. The stone floors of medieval great halls, often covered with rushes and herbs, offered a deceptively rustic charm. While these organic coverings did provide a minor degree of insulation from the cold stone and a somewhat softer surface for walking and sleeping, their most significant and ultimately most horrifying purpose was as a primitive, absorbent form of disposable flooring. The critical and utterly unsanitary flaw in this system was that these layers were very rarely disposed of at all. Instead of undertaking the laborious and backbreaking process of thoroughly sweeping a vast uneven stone floor, servants simply took the easier route, throwing a fresh layer of rushes directly on top of the old, already soiled ones. As a winter progressed, this continuous layering created a dense, compacted, and slowly composting mat of filth that could accumulate to several inches thick, forming a truly repulsive carpet of grime. This vile floor became a living, breathing, disgusting archaeological record of castle life. Imagine taking a cross-section of this putrid stratum. It would reveal a horrifying timeline of everything that had been dropped, spilled, or deposited over many months. Each layer told a story. Ale, sloshed and spilled, soaking into the reeds, gnawed on bones discarded by feasting lords and subsequently tossed to the resident dogs, congealed grease from countless meals, droplets of human spittle, faint dried bloodstains from minor scuffles or accidents, and pervasively, the droppings from the hounds and other animals that roamed freely through the hall. All of these repulsive elements were inexorably ground and compacted into the rotting vegetation, creating a sickening melange. The sheer horror of this situation was so profound that even the great Dutch scholar Erasmus, upon visiting England at the tail end of this period, was famously appalled. He vividly described the floors as harboring a collection of phlegm, vomit, the urine of dogs and men, scraps of fish, and other filth that is not fit to be mentioned. This putrid, multi-layered floor lasagna was not just unpleasant, it was a flourishing ecosystem, a veritable paradise for an army of vermin, scurrying rats, mice, and countless insects, and critically, a highly potent breeding ground for a vast array of disease-causing bacteria and disease. The monumental and utterly nauseating task of periodically removing this entire accumulated layer of putrescence, perhaps only once or twice a year, highlights the sheer extent of the problem. To walk through the Great Hall was not merely to traverse a chamber. It was to literally tread upon a physical, disgusting history of the winter's accumulated grime and slow organic decay. Beneath the seemingly rustic charm of scattered rushes and aromatic herbs, the stone floor of a medieval great hall harbored a deeply unsettling and fundamentally unsanitary secret. While these organic coverings did offer a marginal degree of insulation against the cold, unforgiving stone and a slightly softer surface for daily foot traffic and even sleeping, their true and most horrifying primary function was that of a primitive, absorbent, and ostensibly disposable flooring system. The profound and utterly disgusting issue, however, was the stark reality that these layers were almost never actually disposed of. Instead of the back-breaking, time-consuming labor required to thoroughly sweep and clean a vast, often uneven stone surface, the expedient, albeit horrifyingly unhygienic solution adopted by servants was simply to throw a fresh layer of rushes directly on top of the old, increasingly soiled and decaying ones. As the colder months of winter progressed, this continuous practice of layering resulted in the formation of a dense, matted, and slowly composting accumulation of filth that could steadily grow to be several inches thick, effectively transforming the hall into a giant, repulsive composting bin underfoot. This abominable garbage-layered floor became, in essence, a grim, living archaeological record of daily life within the castle's walls. Imagine the disturbing revelations a cross-section of this vile stratum would unveil. A grotesque timeline of everything that had been dropped, spilled, or deposited over the course of many months. Each distinct layer was a testament to the routines and realities of medieval existence. The dark stains of spilled ale, soaking deeply into the interwoven reeds, the scattered, gnawed-on bones, carelessly discarded from feasts and subsequently tossed to the ever-present dogs, the congealed grease and food scraps from countless meals, droplets of human spittle, drying and merging into the organic matrix, faint, dried bloodstains from minor scuffles or accidental cuts, and perhaps most disturbingly, the pervasive droppings from the various hounds, livestock, and other animals that roamed freely throughout the hall's confines. All these repulsive elements were inexorably ground, compacted, and integrated into the putrefying vegetation, creating a truly sickening melange. The revulsion this practice inspired was so profound that even the esteemed Dutch scholar Erasmus, upon his visit to England at the tail end of this period, was famously horrified. In the stark reality of medieval life, from the first light of dawn to the creeping shadows of dusk, ale was not merely a beverage, but an absolute necessity, consumed with a fervor that puzzles modern sensibilities. The profound reason for this pervasive consumption lay in a world utterly devoid of modern sanitation systems, where the very act of drinking water was a perilous gamble with life itself. Wells, even those nestled within the protective confines of a castle bailey, were alarmingly susceptible to contamination, easily tainted by the runoff from nearby livestock pens, animal waste, and general refuse. Simultaneously, nearby rivers, often the primary source of water for communities, were routinely utilized as open sewers, becoming conduits for human waste and industrial effluvium. To partake in a simple cup of water was, therefore, to engage in a terrifying game of Russian roulette, risking exposure to debilitating and frequently fatal diseases such as dysentery, cholera, and typhoid. The profound genius of the brewing process, however, offered a life-saving solution. The essential step of boiling the water for an extended period effectively sterilized it, eradicating the vast majority of dangerous microbes and making it safe for consumption. Consequently, ale in the medieval period was far from a luxury item or a purely recreational beverage. It was an indispensable, fundamental staple of the diet, vital for the survival and sustenance of every man, woman, and child. Beyond its crucial role as a purified liquid, ale served as a significant source of nutrition in a physically demanding world. A single pint of medieval ale, depending on its strength and ingredients, could deliver a substantial caloric punch, often containing between 300 and 400 calories. This provided much-needed energy for a life defined by hard labor, whether it be tilling fields, constructing fortifications, or engaging in warfare. Even children whose delicate systems were particularly vulnerable to waterborne illnesses partook in this liquid diet. They were given a very low-alcohol version, affectionately known as small beer or table beer, typically made from the second or even third rinsing of the malted barley. While undeniably weak in alcoholic content, this small beer was nevertheless immeasurably safer than any available water source, providing essential hydration and much-needed calories for growing bodies. It was far from uncommon for an adult male, facing a day of strenuous activity, to consume an astonishing amount, up to a gallon of ale per day, to maintain energy and hydration. Brewing itself was not an occasional task but a constant, integral household chore, typically managed by the women of the castle, known as the alewives, whose skill was paramount. Indeed, a lord's reputation and the very morale of his household and soldiers could hinge on the quality and strength of his brew. Providing good, strong ale was key to maintaining loyalty and social cohesion. In summation, medieval people were not merely drinking to achieve intoxication. They were fundamentally drinking to stay alive, a daily ritual born of necessity rather than indulgence. Falling ill within the formidable walls of a medieval castle during the unforgiving winter months was a terrifying prospect, as one's chances of survival plummeted dramatically. The harsh environmental conditions, pervasive cold, persistent dampness, and the ever-present smoke from open hearths conspired to create a perfect breeding ground for a plethora of respiratory illnesses, most notably the deadly scourges of pneumonia and bronchitis. However, the true horror often lay not in the diseases themselves, But in the prescribed cures, which were, with alarming frequency, far more terrifying and demonstrably deadlier than the ailments they purported to treat. Medieval medicine was not, as modern understanding dictates, rooted in empirical science. Instead, it was firmly entrenched in the ancient Greek theory of the four humors, a philosophical framework that posited the human body was composed of four essential bodily fluids: blood, characterized as hot and moist; phlegm, cold and moist; yellow bile, hot and dry; and black bile, cold and dry. A state of perfect health was believed to exist only when these four humors were in a precise and harmonious balance within the individual. Winter, in the prevailing humoral understanding, was considered a season intrinsically dominated by phlegm, a cold and moist humor. This theoretical imbalance was believed to render individuals particularly susceptible to cold and moist ailments, neatly encompassing the respiratory afflictions rampant during this period. If a patient presented with the unmistakable symptoms of a fever and a persistent cough, a medieval physician or leech would almost certainly arrive at the conclusion that the individual was suffering from an overwhelming excess of hot, moist blood in their system. The logical and tragically flawed cure, therefore, was to meticulously remove this perceived excess humor through the practice of bloodletting. This was typically accomplished through one of two primary methods: either by making a precise incision in a vein with a specialized lancet, or, even more commonly, by applying living leeches to the skin, allowing them to engorge themselves on and thus suck out the supposedly tainted blood. This barbaric practice, regrettably, did absolutely nothing to combat the underlying infection or disease. On the contrary, it did everything to severely weaken the already compromised patient, frequently precipitating a state of shock, further suppressing their immune system, and ultimately hastening their inevitable death. Other equally common and often debilitating treatments included violently purging the body with powerful laxatives and emetics, designed to expel excess bile, or applying foul-smelling poultices concocted from truly repulsive ingredients, such as animal dung and various noxious herbs, all believed to draw out illness. With a complete and utter lack of understanding regarding the existence of germs or the mechanisms of contagion, sick individuals were not isolated. This egregious oversight allowed infectious diseases to sweep through the crowded, often unsanitary, and enclosed castle populations with terrifying and often genocidal speed. In such a grim medical landscape, seeking professional medical help was, in many cases, a bizarre and ultimately fatal decision. The pervasive, almost absolute darkness of a medieval winter night was not merely an inconvenience, but a constant and formidable adversary to the inhabitants of a castle. To wage this nightly battle, they relied on primitive forms of illumination, each coming with its own peculiar and often deeply unpleasant costs. The most ubiquitous source of artificial light for virtually everyone, save for the most exceptionally wealthy, was the humble but problematic tallow candle. Tallow, the raw material for these essential luminaries, is essentially rendered animal fat, typically derived from beef or mutton. The very process of making these candles was a messy, often stomach-turning chore, involving the heating and purification of animal byproducts. The light they eventually produced was meager at best, dim, flickering, and prone to sputtering. Beyond their poor illumination, tallow candles continuously emitted a thick, greasy black smoke that over time coated walls, ceilings, and every surface with a layer of sooty grime. Far worse, however, was the unbearable stench they produced, filling the enclosed living spaces of the castle with the pervasive, rancid odor of burning animal fat, a smell that clung to everything and everyone. For those even further down the economic ladder, a more desperate and even less effective option for light was the rudimentary rushlight. This incredibly simple device consisted of nothing more than a piece of dried rush, a common marsh plant readily available, that had been repeatedly dipped in leftover kitchen grease or any other readily available animal fat. A typical rushlight offered a painfully short illumination, burning for perhaps only 15 to 20 minutes at most, and produced a flickering, pitifully dim light, often emitting less than a mere 1% of the brightness of a modern 60-watt incandescent bulb. It was barely sufficient to prevent one from literally walking into a wall in the pitch black, but utterly inadequate for any task requiring even a modicum of clear vision, such as reading, writing, or engaging in fine handiwork. The image of clean burning, subtly scented beeswax candles that modern sensibilities often associate with the medieval era was in reality an extreme luxury. Their exorbitant cost made them prohibitively expensive for common use, reserving them almost exclusively for the hallowed altars within the castle chapel, and, on rare occasions, for the Lord's private dining table during special events. For the vast majority of castle inhabitants, the unavoidable price of pushing back against the encroaching darkness was to fill their precious living spaces with foul, persistent odors, pervasive greasy smoke, and the constant, gnawing fear of a sputtering, unstable flame igniting precious bedding or straw. How did the inhabitants of a medieval castle possibly endure the overwhelming, multi-layered assault of their daily existence? The pervasive reek of unwashed bodies, the putrid smell of rotting floor rushes, the pungent odor of animal dung, and the acrid, smoky stench of burning tallow. The unvarnished truth is that, for the most part, they simply did. Their physiological and psychological tolerance for odors that modern sensibilities would find utterly unbearable was, by sheer necessity, orders of magnitude higher. Nevertheless, even in this era of olfactory assault, attempts were made, however futile, to mask the most offensive elements. Wealthy households, in particular, practiced the art of employing strewing herbs, meticulously scattering highly aromatic plants such as lavender, chamomile, meadowsweet, and mint directly amongst the rushes covering the floor. The underlying theory behind this practice was elegantly simple. As people traversed the Great Hall, their footsteps would crush the herbs underfoot, thereby releasing a more pleasant, fragrant scent into the ambient air, temporarily overpowering the underlying stench. In the harsh light of reality, however, this was a short-lived and largely ineffectual gesture. The freshly scattered herbs, no matter how fragrant initially, quickly became trampled, bruised, and inextricably mixed with the accumulated, decomposing filth of the underlying floor layers. Far from creating a lasting, pleasant aroma, this practice often merely added a new complex layer of sweet vegetal decay to the already intricate and horrifying bouquet of existing smells. For a more personal, albeit still limited solution, noble men and women frequently carried pomanders. These were small, often exquisitely crafted metal balls, typically worn suspended from a chain, designed with a hinged mechanism that allowed them to be opened and filled with a potent mixture of highly aromatic substances. Common ingredients included pungent cloves, warming cinnamon, musky compounds, or the fantastically expensive and exotic ambergris. When the surrounding stench became truly overwhelming and unbearable, a person could discreetly lift the pomander to their nose, affording themselves a brief, fleeting reprieve from the environmental assault. This entire endeavor was never about achieving a genuinely clean or fresh environment. Rather, it was a desperate and ultimately losing battle to construct a small, temporary, and intensely personal bubble of marginally less offensive air in a world that, from every corner, unapologetically reeked of decomposition, waste, and pervasive grime. Contrary to the romanticized image of knights leisurely warming themselves by a roaring fire, winter in a medieval castle was anything but a period of restful idleness. Instead, it was a time of intense, absolutely crucial, and often mind-numbingly repetitive labor. With the agricultural cycle largely paused due to frozen ground and harsh weather, this perceived downtime was paradoxically filled with an unending array of essential maintenance tasks, all vital for the castle's very survival and the Lord's imperative military readiness. The sheer boredom of winter, in a sense, was weaponized, channeled directly into a relentless battle against the slow but inevitable decay of all material possessions. Men from the lowliest laborers to seasoned soldiers would spend countless, grueling hours toiling in the dim, smoky confines of the armory or the searing heat of the blacksmith's forge. Their tasks were endless, derusting thousands of individual chainmail links by tumbling them in large barrels filled with abrasive sand and acidic vinegar, meticulously sharpening countless swords, daggers, and arrowheads until they gleamed with lethal precision painstakingly repairing intricate leather harnesses and straps until their fingers were raw and chafed, and fletching hundreds, if not thousands, of new arrows, ensuring a ready supply for the military campaigns that would inevitably resume with the thaw of spring. Meanwhile, the women of the castle, from dawn until dusk, served as the indispensable engine of the entire textile economy, their labor literally clothing the household and military. They were perpetually occupied with the monumental task of processing raw wool, an arduous multi-step process that began with meticulously carding the fibers to align them, then spinning the prepared wool into durable thread using simple drop spindles, and finally weaving that painstakingly created thread into rough, utilitarian cloth on large, cumbersome looms. A single tunic, a common garment, could easily represent hundreds of hours of dedicated female labor, from sheep's back to finished cloth. Even noble women, though largely spared the heaviest and most physically demanding work, would dedicate their days to intricate embroidery, meticulously stitching the elaborate tapestries and finely crafted clothes that were not merely decorative but served as overt, undeniable signifiers of their family's immense wealth, elevated status, and cultural sophistication. This wasn't merely a quaint hobby or a pleasant pastime. It was an urgent, ceaseless race against entropy, the universal tendency for all things to fall into disorder and disrepair. Everything within the castle, from weapons to clothing to structures, was in a constant state of deterioration, and winter offered the only dedicated window of opportunity to repair, reinforce, and replenish before the frantic, demanding seasons of planting crops and embarking on warfare began anew. These repetitive, almost hypnotic tasks were the thin, laborious line standing between the entire castle community and a catastrophic failure of essential equipment, weapons, or clothing precisely when they would be needed most desperately on the battlefield or in the fields. A massive stone castle, hunkered down against the brutal onslaught of winter, was anything but silent. Far from a bastion of quiet solitude, it was instead a living, breathing entity, constantly reverberating with an unsettling and deeply nerve-wracking symphony of sounds. This ceaseless acoustic backdrop served as a constant, auditory reminder of the world's inherent hostility and the castle's perpetual struggle against the elements. The wind, utterly unobstructed as it swept across the open, desolate landscape, did not merely blow against the imposing stone walls. It seemed to possess a malevolent intelligence, almost a predatory will. It screamed, shrieked, and howled with an almost banshee-like intensity as it forced its way through every narrow arrow slit, through the countless tiny gaps around the ill-fitting wooden shutters, and through every crack and crevice in the ancient masonry. This relentless intrusion created a terrifying, high-pitched, almost flute-like wailing effect that could persist for days, even weeks, on end without reprieve. This was not just atmospheric noise. It was the visceral sound of the outside world, a relentless, icy force attempting to breach the very defenses of the stronghold. Inside the castle's supposedly protected confines, any fleeting moment of relative quiet was mercilessly punctuated by the maddeningly persistent drip, drip, drip of water. Poorly maintained roofs, constructed from thatch that sagged, wooden shingles that warped, or even heavy slate tiles that had shifted due to relentless wind, allowed moisture to seep through their compromised integrity. The porous stone itself, the very fabric of the castle, would absorb significant amounts of water, which would then slowly, relentlessly drip into the rooms below, forming puddles on the cold stone floors. This incessant dripping was a constant auditory reminder of the pervasive dampness that was insidiously trying to rot the castle from the inside out, fostering mold, mildew, and decay. To this primary acoustic backdrop of howling wind and persistent drips, one must add a cacophony of other sounds integral to medieval castle life: the distant, eerie, and undeniably hungry howling of wolves beyond the protective walls, a chilling reminder of wild nature; the frantic, unsettling, scuttling and gnawing of rats and mice within the very fabric of the walls and beneath the floorboards, a testament to the rampant vermin infestation; the incessant, rattling, phlegmy coughs of the sick and dying echoing through corridors; The deep, resonant creak and groan of massive wooden doors pivoting on rusty, ungreased iron hinges, and the sharp, sudden clatter of a guard's pike or armored footfall on the unforgiving stone floor. It was a soundscape meticulously designed, it seemed, to fray the nerves, erode mental fortitude, and render true peace, tranquility, or genuine silence an utterly impossible luxury, making the castle a perpetual sensory assault. In an era predating the concept of expansive wardrobes and the daily ritual of hot showers, the intertwined realms of clothing and personal hygiene operated under a set of principles fundamentally alien to modern sensibilities. The vast majority of individuals, from the lowliest castle servant to the lord himself, possessed an astonishingly limited number of clothing sets. The foundational garment, universally adopted across all social classes and genders, was a simple long shirt or shift, typically fashioned from durable and absorbent linen. This singular piece of clothing served as the veritable workhorse of their entire wardrobe. It functioned simultaneously as their underwear, their pajamas for sleeping, and their primary base layer of clothing, all rolled into one indispensable item. The heavier, more durable, and significantly more expensive outer garments, invariably crafted from wool, were remarkably rarely, if ever, subjected to washing, as the harsh cleaning processes of the time could easily damage or shrink their valuable fibers, rendering them useless. The linen shift, conversely, was meticulously designed to act as the crucial absorbent layer, its primary purpose being to protect the precious outer garments from the direct contact with the body's sweat, oils, and general grime. It was, therefore, the item most likely to be changed and laundered with greater frequency. But frequently in this context is an intensely relative term, vastly different from our contemporary understanding. A wealthy nobleman might indeed possess a small collection of these linen shifts, theoretically allowing him the luxury of changing every few days. A servant, however, often owned only one or, at best, two such garments. This stark reality meant that the same piece of cloth was worn directly against the skin for extended periods, stretching from several days to even a full week or more, without removal. They labored in it, slept in it, and lived their entire waking lives in it until it became stiff, discolored, and heavily impregnated with accumulated sweat, body oils, and the pervasive grime of daily medieval existence. The laundry process itself was a monumental and arduous chore, involving harsh, caustic soap typically made from lye and animal fat, followed by a physically demanding process of beating the clothes with wooden paddles in often freezing river water or communal wash troughs. The humble linen shift was, by far, the single most personal and constantly worn item of clothing, truly functioning as a second skin that absorbed and bore witness to the unvarnished, often unpleasant reality of daily medieval life. The modern word curfew typically conjures images of adolescent restrictions or societal deadlines for public activity. Its medieval etymology, however, unveils a far more primal, terrifying, and indeed existential concern. The term directly originates from the Old French phrase couvre-feu, which when literally translated means cover fire. The nightly resonant ringing of the curfew bell, emanating from the solemn heights of the castle chapel or a prominent nearby town church, was far from a mere suggestion for bedtime. Instead, it constituted a deadly serious, legally binding, and universally understood fire safety command incumbent upon every single household within the castle walls or the adjacent settlement. The resounding peal of the bell served as an immediate, unequivocal order for everyone to either meticulously cover the glowing embers of their hearths with a specially designed ceramic or metal lid, or to otherwise thoroughly damp down and extinguish any lingering flames for the duration of the night. In a world precariously constructed almost entirely of highly combustible materials, massive wooden beams, walls often lined with wattle and daub, highly flammable thatch for roofing, and interiors lavishly draped with easily ignitable textiles, and where open flames represented the sole available source of both heat and light, a single stray spark in the night was not merely a hazard, but the single greatest, most pervasive threat to the very existence of the entire community. A fire ignited from an untended hearth could instantly catch onto a dry straw mattress, a richly embroidered wall tapestry, or a stack of kindling in mere seconds. From this initial ignition point, it could spread with terrifying and unstoppable speed through a castle's intricate wooden interior structures, across its highly flammable thatched roofs, and engulf adjacent buildings, trapping and incinerating dozens, if not hundreds, of sleeping inhabitants. The firefighting technology of the era was lamentably, even pathetically, inadequate, comprising little more than desperately organized bucket brigades attempting to douse flames with limited supplies of water and sand, and long hooks intended to crudely pull down burning sections of buildings in a desperate attempt to create fire breaks. Consequently, the couvre-feu was not just a precaution, it was the primary, most effective, and indeed the only widespread form of preventative firefighting available. It represented a fundamental communal responsibility, forged not from abstract civic duty, but from a very real, shared, and deeply ingrained terror of being burned alive in one's own bed, trapped by the inferno. So, was medieval sleep better? By our standards of comfort, absolutely not. It was cold, crowded, smelly, and plagued by pests. But their methods reveal a deep practical intelligence. They created warm microclimates, pooled their body heat for communal survival, and, most importantly, they surrendered to the natural rhythms of light and dark. Today, we live in climate-controlled isolation. We fight against the night with artificial light, disrupting our natural sleep cycles and leading to a host of modern sleep disorders. The medieval castle dweller, in their freezing stone box, was arguably more in tune with their own biology. They didn't see the long winter night as an inconvenience to be conquered with technology, but as a reality to be lived through, together. Their story isn't just one of hardship, but one of resilience and a deep, instinctual connection to the cycles of the natural world, a connection we may have lost. If you enjoyed this look into the cold, hard reality of the past, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss our next deep dive into the historical truths that are stranger and smarter than any fantasy.